Hello, I'm Garrett McNeill, and I'm working in the Department of Psychology under Dr. Will Hart and Braden as the project lead on a study investigating the situational modifiers of atheist prejudice as a function of identity signaling. So in this presentation, we're going to do a couple things. First, we're going to go over some background information to explain why atheist prejudice is even important to look at, and then we're going to go into some of the theoretical foundation for some of the behavioral modification strategies that we think may be able to serve as a moderator for these behaviors. And then we're going to go into the empirical basis, how we chose to approach this issue, as well as how we plan on testing it next semester. And so the American cultural landscape is one that is changing very drastically and very rapidly. 28% of US adults now identify as religious nones, and this includes atheists, agnostics, and those that don't associate with a particular church body. And 80% of US adults believe that religious influence in the country is declining. And of this 80%, 50% actually believe that this is having a negative impact on the country. This negative perception has led to a widespread moral anxiety surrounding the rise of secularism. And it's also led to this social movement called Christian nationalism that seeks to return Christianity to the forefront of American public and private life. And quite paradoxically, though representing only 4% of the 28% minority, atheists have become the forefront of this movement against areligiosity. And so how does this atheist prejudice typically look like? Atheists are typically reported by Christians to seem immoral and untrustworthy. And this prejudice is a general indicator of moral threat. And ironically, this is expressed more strongly in more religious individuals. So as an individual gets more religious, they actually end up being more prejudiced, as well as their prejudice also becomes more severe. And so we know that this can't be a function of just religiosity. Something else has to be happening here. And so we found out that this is a function of identity signaling, this process we call identity signaling, that is a signal of in-group loyalty. And this sounds like a foreign concept, but it's actually something that happens pretty common on a daily basis socially. If you're interested in joining an in-group, you have this desired group in mind of joining, it's in your best interest to show at least disinterest, but sometimes dislike, and in this case, disdain of your out-group, so that the in-group thinks you're more interested in them. And so this is essentially what's happening here. And so what we have to look into first is this concept of identity signaling. And identity signaling is the manipulation of symbolic characteristics of desired identity, their manipulation of strategic behaviors and expressed attitudes. And this serves two purposes. First, it serves a public function. You want to express your identity through these manipulated characteristics and express attitudes to others so that you have this persona that they experience you as. But it also has this private purpose of maintaining a internal self-consistency as well as this moral integrity. And so you constantly signal your identity to yourself every single day to be coherent internally and convince yourself of who you are. And so with religious individuals, prejudice might be one of these signaling mechanisms. And so this expression is obviously going to vary based on social context and your audience. So a very understandable instance of this would be your identity signaling of your religion would be very different in a church setting where you're praying and singing hymns than it would be in like a university classroom. And so what identity are Christians actually trying to signal? And so Christian identity is comprised of a multitude of different characteristics and values taught by the prophet Jesus Christ during his ministry. But this includes and not limited to compassion, love, and forgiveness. These are traits that Christians often respond to very emotionally. And so the idea is that acting consistently with these values is going to preserve this idea of self-coherence. And vice versa, acting inconsistently with these values is going to deteriorate this self-coherence. And so in the same vein, affirming this moral identity is going to reduce your defensive behavior, whereas contradicting this moral identity should increase your defensive behaviors. And so these threats to identity lead to these exclusionary expression mechanisms such as prejudice, and in this case, prejudice against atheists that comprise your outgroup. And so our specific hypothesis for this study is that affirmation of specifically Christian identity should lower prejudice towards atheists, while contradiction of Christian identity should heighten prejudice against atheists. And so this is an extension of a previous study done by Lambert et al. In 2025, and a series of 5 different studies in which study 1 found that religious individuals are actually less likely to choose atheist dating partners. So you see the selectivity on a very intimate social level. And then expressing atheist distrust actually perceives your increases your perceived religiosity. So if the more I distrust an atheist, the more somebody thinks I am religious. And so study 3 found that individuals that use this mechanism are actually aware of their usage of this mechanism for signaling purposes. And then study 4 found that that religious individuals actually carry this identity threat with them when asked to whether spatially or conceptually associate with atheists. So this could be in the same room as somebody, or just merely saying you are a friend of atheists. This generates this sense of identity threat internally. And then study 5 found that atheists are actually Christians are actually capable of adapting their atheist prejudice depending on what the circumstance demands. And so if they're told that more prejudice indicates more Christian identity, then they become more prejudiced. But if they're told that less prejudice indicates more higher Christian identity, they become more tolerant. And so we're looking at 2 different behavioral modification strategies here: attributive predication and identity feedback. And these are going to be on 2 planes, positive and negative valence. And the major difference between the 2 is syntax. So attributive predication is group level identification. Christians are kind, Christians are not mean. Whereas identity feedback is going to be you are kind, you are not mean. And so you have this difference between referring to the group that somebody might be involved in or referring to them personally. And both of them manipulate moral concept, but they're going to be on different planes. And so study 1's going to show how affirmative attributive predication is going to impact this. And they're going to have the same study design. The only difference, pay attention to the wording here, they reference Christians, and this references the you instead of Christians. And so this is going to be our prediction for both studies. Compared to a neutral control, we think that confirmatory attributive predication and positive identity feedback are going to lower atheist prejudice, while contradictory attributive predication and negative identity feedback is going to do the exact opposite. You're going to heighten the atheist prejudice shown. And so this is a brief map of what the study is going to look like. You're going to have a repetition of activities where the participant is going to go through these activities and they're going to receive different feedback, where the survey is basically going to give them feedback on whether it thinks that they're Christian or atheist, and see how their prejudicial behaviors change when they are repetitively contradicted or repetitively confirmed. And study 2 is going to do basically the same thing, except it's a reference to the you instead of to the group level Christians. Thank you. Any questions?
So if there's a potential prejudice for the out group, I'm wondering if there's such a concept, a dual of this that is atheist identity and defensive behavior. So what if that idea makes sense? What would that look like, and would there be things that would overlap the general kind of concepts with Christian identity, and would there be anything that would maybe even different? So I'm just trying to look at the other side of atheist identity and what would be the consequences or topics for that.
So you would assume that it would function basically the same way, because you have this out group and this in group. The out group being Christians and the in group being atheists, and there's going to be that conflict there every single time. The only difference in this scenario is that you're atheist or you're a minority, and they still prove to be a minority in the U.S. 4% of the U.S. adult population, and so Christians are the vast majority, and so you're going to have a different. The prevalence is going to be way different, and there's also going to be a lot more animosity because atheists are the minority and they feel that they're the minority. And so if you were to switch the tables and atheists became a majority and Christians became a minority, you might be able to see the same results, but you can't really expect to see that in the real world.
Do you see differences in atheist prejudice across religions and even across Christian denominations?
You would. So with denominations specifically, that becomes a problem with so many different subgroups. The problem with the reason why we look at atheists and then Christians broadly is because they're polar opposites on a scale, right? You have theists and atheists. And so everybody within a Christian denomination is going to believe in some type of a God. And so any person within a religion is going to have that same type of dynamic. They're going to believe in a God. They're a theist. And so atheists and theists, different sides of polar opposites. But if you're comparing people within that are within a theist group, or even within the same group that has the same religious tenets, you're not going to see as much variation as you would between atheists and Christians. So we're going to investigate this firstly, and then we may go into that. But then you also have issues with, especially with collecting a sample population that's representative of every religion. Very hard in the American South, where Christian is a vast majority. So that becomes an issue, just representative samples.
So how are you establishing your control value when looking at that last graph?
So what's going to happen with the control value is somebody's going to go through, let me go back to that. So typically when you go through these activities, you're going to receive feedback from the survey. And what this feedback is going to do is it's going to manipulate the way you respond to the next activity, because the survey's either said it thinks you're Christian or it thinks you're atheist. And so you're going to change. The idea is that you change your behavior to indicate to the survey that you're either agreeing with their perception of you or disagreeing with it. And so what's happening with the control group is it's just simply this participant is just going through the activities without any feedback whatsoever. And so this is an environment where feedback has absolutely no effect on somebody's representation of themselves. And so in that environment, you can see if atheist prejudice is something that a Christian is likely to jump to, or if it's something that's purely heightened by the sense of needing to show their identity.